In the 1950s and 60s, and I think even up into the 70s, there were some really interesting advertisements in comic books. And one of them that I always thought was intriguing was the X-ray glasses. And now common wisdom among my friends and I were that we would pay for something that wouldn't really work, and there was all kinds of urban legend about that, about somebody who got them and they were really disappointed. But one day, my friend and I decided that we would make a secret pact and not tell anyone, and we pooled our money together and sent off for some X-ray glasses. And we decided to have them sent to his house because in my house, my mom got to the mail pretty fast, and in his house, he was able to get to the mail, and it was actually kind of embarrassing to admit that you wanted some X-ray glasses for reasons that a very young adolescent boy would want X-ray glasses. I like to think of it as I was always looking for a deeper truth. Do what you want with that. We got our X-ray glasses, and it was amazing. I remember when we sent off for them because we pooled our money together, and it was, I don't know why, but it was all in coins, and so we put all these coins in the envelope and taped it shut and sent it to somewhere in New Jersey, and the coins actually made it, and the glasses came back. And like so many sojourns into a deep level of spirituality, it sort of let us down. When we got the X-ray glasses back, it turned out that they didn't work as well as we had hoped and dreamed. All those sleepless nights of hopes that they would work. But I got to tell you, we tried them in every environment possible. Every bit of lighting, every bit of darkness. We ended up getting our faces slapped a few times. I don't know if you remember those ads, but it was hard to hide them because they had the spiral on the lens. So it wasn't like you could even go incognito with them, When you put them on, it was pretty obvious. So. Back in the early part of the 20th century, there was a birth of what we call now today environmentalism to some extent. The late 19th century into the early 20th century. The ground floor, the bedrock of environmentalism is something to the degree of, say, a holistic approach. And what I mean by that is that for the first time, science began to actually see that things were interconnected. In other words, up until that point, it was believed that you could go into any environment and you could harvest an animal to where it didn't exist anymore and you didn't touch the rest of the environment. You could harvest a tree or a plant or a flower, you could completely wipe it out and it would have no consequences. But what was discovered in the early part of the 20th century, and this is one of the ways it was discovered because different biologists and different people from science began to awaken to the same idea. But in one way, this is how it came up, and that was that there were marine biologists, especially here on the West Coast, who simply would go out and sit next to a tide pool. Now before this, they might go out to a tide pool and harvest the starfish out of it or harvest other fish out of it or get the snails out of it and take them back, and they would sell them to laboratories or they would do experiments on them. But for the first time, marine biologists decided to go out and to sit and just look into a tide pool, to look deep into a tide pool. A tide pool. Not the depths of the ocean, not to the very bottom, not the vastness of the ocean, but if you go to places like here on the West Coast, Monterey and Mendocino and Fort Bragg, and you go up onto the northern shores, you find these beautiful tide pools. And to sit and simply watch. To watch a tide pool for a day, to watch it over the course of a couple of days. And how this led to environmentalism, and how this led to a holistic approach to life, with a capital L, life, was that the scientists for the first time began to understand and look at the interconnectedness of life. that everything that lived within those tide pools was interconnected. It was a family of different plants and animals and species and all kinds of things down there. And they actually, everything about them was to assist each other in this thing called life. Ernest Holmes talks about the idea, if you look deeply into nature, she will share her secrets with you. And what are the secrets he's talking about? He's talking about the idea that there is a presence of spirit in everything. This thing, whether you want to call it God or infinite spirit or the creative force, the great cosmic parent, whatever you want to call it. Holmes simply called it life. Myrtle Fillmore, when I read from her this morning, she said life with a capital L, life. God is life, that life force, and intelligence. And the scientists who watched those tide pools, they looked down and they saw an intelligence. They saw a synchronicity. They saw a beautiful dance of life with a capital L. That there was a presence there. It was as if Holmes and the scientists wanted their X-ray glasses. They wanted to look deeper into things. Why? Because religion up until that point, especially here in the West, and I want to confine it to the West, but religion in the West, the Judeo-Christian, had decided in something called duality. In other words, what was being taught in Christianity was that God was somewhere else and we were over here, life was over here, the material world was over here, and somehow we had to build a bridge to God. That bridge could come through salvation, it could come through a priest, it could come through a rite, it could come through a ritual, it could come through something. But we had to build a bridge to God. And one of the questions that I get as a metaphysical teacher, and I think any of us who are seekers, any of us who find ourselves in spiritual conversations, one of the questions that always comes up is, why is it that if God is in everything, why is it that as human beings at some level, especially in certain religions, why is it that duality was embraced? And in the Judeo-Christian world, there are two reasons for that. One of them is the introduction of Calvin, a gentleman whose name was Calvin, and he was around a few centuries ago, very bright guy, very intellectual, theological person, and he looked out into the world, and he didn't have his X-ray glasses on, and he didn't spend any time around a tide pool, and he simply saw the world as good things happening and bad things happening and darkness and light and life and death. Now, the last one is the most important, life and death. And Calvin looked out at the world and he simply saw the world divided into two places, life and death. And so metaphysical, theological people and thinkers will say that one of the main reasons that we as human beings, especially in the West, have embraced duality so distinctly, and I would argue that it permeates our culture, is because we have not reconciled our own mortality. In other words, if you look at death as death with a capital D, if you look at death as death, then there is nothing to do with it but to come to the conclusion that life has ended. But see, when the scientists looked down into the tide pools and they watched them for a long time, they saw cycles and systems, and they saw life change, not end, but change. They saw it move energetically from one form to another. And what Ernest Holmes says basically is, he says, if we look deeply enough into nature, what we will discover is that God, if that's the word you want to give it, God is omnipresent, which means ever present. It is there. It is in the tide pool. And God is omnipotent, which means completely engaged. Completely engaged. In other words, God does not take a day off. God does not take a moment off. God does not abandon us. It is we who do not see God because of the blinders that we put on of theological ideas like Calvinism. So, what am I talking about? What Ernest Holmes would say, and Myrtle Fillmore and other people would say, they say, okay, we believe that life cannot be divided against itself. What does that mean? That means that if you look down into the tide pool, you don't ever see life end. You see it move, you see it transform, you see it become other things. It doesn't ever completely end. And so Holmes would say, life cannot be divided against itself. Life, with a capital L, just is. So, one day we are called into the room of Hospice House, and there is someone there who is 98 years old, been in this world for 98 years. And some would say that this person is laying there and that life is coming to an end. And when we say that, here in the West, listen to what we're saying. Life is coming to an end. And if we take that out to its theological logic, so to speak, then we are saying, if life is coming to an end, then it is going to a place where God is not. That's really what we mean. That's how dualism comes into our thinking. That's where it lives in the West. But Ernest Holmes and Myrtle Fillmore and other people would say, okay, let's walk into that room. And let's say that this person is there coming to the end of a journey. And if we believe that life cannot be divided against itself, then is something coming to an end or is something beginning? Because in the tide pool, nothing comes to an end. It only steps into a beginning. Over and over and over and over again. In other words, to the person laying in the bed, that person would say, God is present and God is engaged. Because life cannot be divided against itself. Because when we look into nature, when we move beyond the theological ideas, then we recognize that there is a presence. There is a presence, and the reason that Holmes and other people referred to this as life is that, we ask the question, in the presence of evolution, for example, what was the driving force behind it? What was the intelligence? What was the life? What was the force that enabled a species to move forward? What is the life and the force that enables us to move forward in our lives? To move through all the different transitions that we go through. To be able to have an artist stand in front of a piece of marble and to transform that into a statue, or an artist stand in front of a canvas and paint something on it, or for us to move from a divorce into a new relationship, for us to move from illness to wellness, for us to move from one aspect of our life to another aspect of our life. What is that driving force? If we look far enough down the microscope, if we look deep enough into the tide pool of life, what is that force? And in metaphysics we say it is life. As Myrtle Fillmore says, God is life that we use for living. What is the engine behind it all? It is the presence of a power, and it is the total engagement of that power, no matter where it is. And science began to, in the early part of the 20th century, they began to have a veil pulled back on the essence of life. Ernest Holmes and the Fillmores and other people who are our metaphysical ancestors, they moved beyond the ideas and the books and the theology and the Bibles and all the rest of it, and they said, let me go into nature, and what is it out here that I can be taught? And so we, in this philosophy, the philosophy that you are here today engaged in, whether you know it or not, is a philosophy of what is called unification. And unification means that God is ever present within me. Now, when Candy was up here as our practitioner today, she made a statement. She made the statement, "You are God." And there were probably some of you who said, "Oh my God, where am I? I don't know if I should be here." Did your whole body pucker when you heard that? You are God. Okay. So what is meant by that? Does it mean, as I stand here today, does it mean that I am the totality of God? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that there is an essence of God that dwells within me, just as there is an essence of God that dwells in that tide pool, dwells in these flowers, dwells in the trees, dwells in everything. There is an essence, a piece of God. You see, we believe that God is a principle, not a person. An absolute principle, expressed in through all creation when understood and seen. Now, it's always there. Doesn't mean we have to understand it and see it for it to work. But the question is, do we put on our X-ray glasses? Do we look at the tide pool so that we can begin to see it at work? A principle, an absolute principle expressed in and through all of creation. And so the question is, why is it that there are times where we feel no God? Why is it that there are times when we can feel so completely lonely and cut off? Why is it there are times when we can be so completely wrong about this thing called life with a capital L? It's because we aren't looking at the tide pool. It's because we've taken off the X-ray glasses. You know, when we got our X-ray glasses in the mail, there was this great little piece that said, "You're going to be able to see things that are normally hidden." They're always there, but they're always hidden. Now, we never got to see them. We wanted to. But the bottom line in terms of spiritual practice as we see it is that we have to sometimes look at what is right there to be willing to reveal those secrets. So, we believe that this principle, this absolute principle, becomes personal when we identify ourselves with it as our indwelling parent. There's a very special place in our teaching. Now, we have all kinds of words for God. In fact, we have classes around here that encourage people to come up with all kinds of lists as to what God is. You know, cosmic creation, universal parent, spirit, essence, life force, creation. But in amongst all those I just gave you, there's a very special word, and I threw it out there, and I want to come back to it, and it's called spirit. And we reserve that word for that very personal relationship. In other words, this principle, this essence of God is in the universe, it's in me, but in me, as me, because I'm a unique expression of God, I grab a hold of the idea of spirit. And I make it very personal to me. Leading to an unlimited acceptance of the birthright of infinite potentiality. So how does God show up in me? God shows up in me as infinite potentiality. And so I move into a place and things are happening in my life that I don't care for. I have that 2 o'clock in the morning feeling of being an atheist, and I feel lonely and I feel dark. I'm in a place where I don't know which direction to go. And so as a metaphysician, I say into the darkness, I don't know what to do. But spirit does. Because spirit is principle. I don't understand this, but spirit does. Because spirit is principle. I don't know how to heal this right now, but spirit does. Because spirit is principle. And we recognize that God is love because we recognize that by its giving nature to its many children of divine manifestations, all that they need. You see, the scientists looked down in the tide pool and they said, wow, everything is taken care of in this tide pool. There is this incredible natural wisdom. There is this givingness of nature to its children that is amazing. I was listening to Science Friday on NPR this week, and they were talking about the idea of the force of nature. And in a scientific world, they talk about, and again, they were basically talking what we talk about in terms of God and life, and they were talking about the wildness and the force of nature. And they said, you know what? If you pave over a field, you pave it all over with asphalt, and you walk away, and you leave it alone, before long, all those little plants start coming up through it. Before long, if you leave it alone, nature will take it back. What is that? That's this incredible force. That is the givingness of life, of spirit to creation. In other words, every single one of those little plants out there that comes up, basically, at some level in their intelligence and their consciousness says, I want to go up there, I want to go towards the sky, I want to go towards the sun, and this thing called life, this givingness of spirit says, okay, here you go, this is everything you need. Everything you need. That is the very nature of this thing called spirit. The givingness of spirit, the givingness of God to give us everything that we need. The idea of taking the time to see. I'm doing a book right now, I'm doing a class, and one of the cornerstones of this class, and it's a writer by the name of Jack Kornfield, and we're about halfway through this class of dealing with his writing. And there's this kind of backdrop in his writing around this thing called spiritual practice. What is spiritual practice? We think of prayer and meditation, and we think of reading things, and we think of going into nature, and we think of maybe coming to a place like this on a weekly basis. We think of journaling. We think of yoga practices. We think of all the different spiritual practices. And what came up for me this week, I was thinking about spiritual practice, and I was thinking about what I was going to talk about today. And I was thinking about the spiritual practice of the scientists around the tide pools. What was their spiritual practice? Their spiritual practice was to sit and observe and to see. Not look, see. To recognize the power and the force that is in front of us. When Ernest Holmes says to look into the depths of nature, to find out what the secrets that she has to reveal, listen to what he's saying. Look, see, expect. And what I discovered in terms of doing this class and thinking about spiritual practice is that no matter what my spiritual practice may be, my job is to slow down enough to see what I'm really looking at. Not what the media wants me to look at, not what religion wants me to look at, not what politics, not what the family, not what anything, but what do I observe? What do I actually see in that place? What are those forces at work there? And to get quiet. And Jack Kornfield talks about in his work taking the one seat, and he sort of patterns that off the idea of the story of the Buddha who sat under the Bodhi tree and took the one seat and took responsibility and slowed down the world around him long enough to truly see what he was looking at And what I've discovered in my spiritual journey through metaphysics and through this teaching is that if I take the time to look deeply, Spirit has been revealed to me. Spirit is always there to be revealed. I found something this week in the Tao Te Ching, which is an ancient text, and it says, "The nameless is the origin of heaven and earth. Desireless, we see the mystery. Desiring, we see the manifestations. These two are the same." Desireless, we see the mystery. Desiring, we see the manifestations. These two are the same. One of the reasons that I think that a lot of our religious ancestors did not see God because God was just so obvious. God is so completely obvious and ordinary, and I don't mean any disrespect for that. God is ordinary. We walk by these flowers today, and they're absolutely beautiful, and we stop for a moment, and we recognize how beautiful they are, and then we move on to a conversation. God is here. What do you think makes them beautiful? God is here. We didn't even see God there. We saw flowers. We saw color. You know, when that perfect doctor came into our life to steer us in a medical direction, did we see that God was there? When we hold the hand of somebody we love in the darkness and we share that love, do we feel God there? When we see something in this world that is absolutely spectacular, do we also see God? When we see that 98-year-old person in a hospice room just covered with the beautiful patina of all that life, stepping into a larger expression, do we see God there? See, God is so obvious, we're not even picking up on it, but it's all around. Michael Beckwith, who is married to Ricky Byers, who you heard sing earlier, he's with the Agape movement. He talks about a very mystical experience he had by going into the jungles of Africa, and he was there with a shaman of some kind. He was being led, and he said that the whole idea was his mindset was to really have revealed to him the presence of Spirit. And he talked about the jungle at some point becoming completely illuminated around him. He wasn't just seeing leaves, he just wasn't seeing grass, he wasn't seeing just animals, he wasn't seeing rocks, he was seeing God showing up all around. God is a principle, ever present. And the thing is that no matter where we may be, I think that the way that we, whatever despair we may be in, whatever challenge we may have in front of us, I think the way we put on our X-ray glasses, the way we look into the tide pool is to first say, God is all there is, and God is right here. No matter how dark this may feel, no matter how disconnected it feels, God is right here, right now. There's a piece in our movement, and when I talk about our movement, I'm talking about New Thought. I'm talking about Centers for Spiritual Living, places like Unity. There's an idea that God is a power for good greater than we are that we can use. God is a power for good greater than we are that we can use. It is all around us. There's a minister who means a lot to me. She's still around. Her name's Carolyn McEwen, who was in Chico for years. And this was a part of her service every single week, as long as I was there. that there would be a time where she would talk about a power for good greater than we are that we can use. So what I want to do is I want to end today with a call and response, and this is what you found in the chairs when you came in. And there's two sides to this. And I'm going to read the emboldened print, and I want you to respond back. A power for good greater than we are that we can use. I want us to just kind of settle into a space, and I would encourage you, if you feel like it, to just take your right hand and put it on your heart as you look at this. And I really want us today to fill this space. I want us to fill this space with the energy of these truths. Okay. God is universal law.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
God is the omnipresent life and substance.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
God is the potentiality of life flowing through us.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
God is the steady stream of renewing and cleansing vitalization of life.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
God is the loving givingness of principle.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
God is the soundness and integrity of evolution.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
God is beauty and wholeness expressed in the simplest and grandest design that exists around and through us.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
God is the universal karmic force.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
God is light and revelation.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
God is the joy of life and the life of joy, right here, right now, always.
A power for good greater than we are that we can use.
And so it is.